Okay, thank you so much. So I think you can hear me right now. And Yushen, can you hear me? Yushen?
Yes, I think we can hear you at least.
Okay,
I can.
okay, good. Okay, probably Yushen is losing her connection, and for me, I just closed my video due to the poor internet connection. So hope you can understand. And thank you so much. And I think we're gonna directly go into the main parts. And so let's see, we can do a translation while we will talk in English. International guest speaker. Sorry, I think I can hear some. I will just myself. And okay, good. Okay, good. We just fixed the technical issue, and then let's continue the talk. So we're really glad to have invited Finnish media theorist Professor Parikka, who teaching in technological culture and aesthetics at the University of Southampton, and he's also the guest scholar at Strelka and conducting the terraforming program, which has a really close connection with our exhibition, since there are several speculative design from terraforming, and we shape our theoretical framework based on Breton's stack. And Breton is also Breton is the director of terraforming and also the director at Strelka. So I guess we are really glad to have this kind of conversation and talk in this pandemic time. And so his publication is also very influential to contemporary media studies. And Professor Parikka's publication has also the translated version in China, and his added book, Media Archaeology, Approaches, Applications and Implications, also has the translated version by Fudan Press. So maybe we can check it on WeChat. We will send the link to all of you guys. And in this talk, Professor Parikka will talk about his recent research relevant to those publications in details later. And before we go into the talk, I think we're gonna do a brief introduction about our exhibition and see how it connects to Professor Parikka's research and projects. Then we will move on to the presentation by him on geopolitical resources and exploitation for media objects. And then we will go on a kind of relevant roundtable conversation. And after that, we will spring his audiovisual essay, which is called Seed Image Ground, on this channel. And then he will also bring his interdisciplinary projects of operational image. And then we can have a further conversation and discussion, and then end up with a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box and WeChat group, and we will select some interesting questions to Parikka and get back from you in Q&A. So I think it's Yishen's turn to introduce our brief statement.
Okay, so you guys can hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, just make sure. So I'm gonna briefly introduce our exhibit because we have already presented that a few times, and we have some archival and review material already published. So I will pick up like a few projects that's related to today's talk. Just a brief introduction on the theory, like in this one, the natural footprints in technological vicissitude. We track the footprints of few natural elements such as air, water, and the connection between Earth and outer space in the three subdivisions in the exhibition, Sky That Comes from Earth, The Neck of Moon, and the Tidal Currents. And in this way, we want to see how those natural elements experience the resource extraction, energy conversion, and in this process, how does the meaning of dwelling, breathing, and sensing changes in the process. And as we exhibit many research-based artwork from Chinese artists, their research also reviews an entangled relationship between Chinese geography, national policies within the context of international relations, as well as indigenous culture, which were shaped in a rapid modernization. So firstly, you can see from this PowerPoint on the left corner, our exhibition is based on the theory of stack by Benjamin Bratton and QiWu by Zhuangzi. In a pre-modern time, the infrastructure such as port, dam, and the water system were still embedded in the mountain and river. They were poetically depicted in ancient Chinese poetries, integrated by the poetic sensory and breathing. But as opposed to nowadays, when modern technology extracts geological resources such as coal mine from deep ground, or construct a water hydraulic project that spans few provinces and reconstruct the regional ecosystem, those infrastructures were guided under a national strategy. Some were left over from Soviet aid project from last century, or some were intended to rapidly modernize ethnic minority groups who occupied southeast rural China. In this way, the pre-modern breeds that go through body, landscape, and our mind depicted by Zhuangzi becomes a modern breath that goes through conditioned interior environment, artificial gas, and etc. So the exhibition is focusing on the changing psychogeographical map in China and the changing ways of breathing and sensing when modern technologies affect how we dwell in space and how the built environment is built in the landscape. And then Xuefei will continue to introduce the theoretical foundation and how it's related to the A Geology of Media.
Okay, so actually, as Yishan have mentioned, that we basically used a theoretical framework of Zhuangzi and contemporary Earth design theories of Benjamin Bratton's stack. So let me just do a brief explanation of QiWu of Zhuangzi, because QiWu is actually the equality of things, and which is to idealize the unification between Chinese landscape and cosmology. And so we can, as we can see in ancient China, we can see the counterbalance between nature and humanity constrained by ritual and order, which means lifa, and folklore, such as Confucianism and something. In the ritualized and mystifies natural observation, Chinese technology is developed at a lower intensity, bound up by religious folklore. So, which means the unification between nature and human is not something natural developed, but is something that limited by a kind of ritual religions. So, in that sense, it shaped a pre-modern infrastructural landscape, architectural residency, such as it is influenced by feng shui and the aesthetics of mountains and rivers, and mostly rooting and the mystification of the unknown nature, diverse from the modern stereotype and modern standard type. And it disintegrates gradually during the process of modernization, and we can see that media and information-led technology has becoming a kind of new situation since the 20th century. So that is where the stack shapes. The stack was a concept raised by Benjamin Bratton in 2050, and he summarized the planetary scale technological world. It is underpinned by geopolitical resource extraction and distribution, and it encompasses the Earth from air to ground with numerous digital objects and the law of algorithm. So we can see the concept of QiWu has been changed, and the idealist ecology that values all things mutually sensible and thinks nothing different between human and nature has been shaped to the harmonization of modern objects and lifestyles. So we share the same modern scientific knowledge and follow the common law of algorithm. And I guess that's what the theory of Benjamin Brereton and also Jussi Parikka has mentioned. So I think it's Yixuan's turn to introduce more details and cases. Yeah.
Okay, so as we mentioned, we have like 3 subtopics in the exhibit. And then like today, I'm just gonna introduce 2 work in the tidal currents. As you can see, it's part of our strategy to just put speculative design with audiovisual essays. So one will articulate the material flow in the ecosystem and the constructed built environments, and the other one reviews how our senses are affected within the environments and a psychogeographical map in the culture construct. In this way, we want to create a dynamic dialogue between Earth's design framework and embodied local knowledge. So in the section of tidal currents, on the left is a mapping of Bitcoin mining's positioning law by researcher and designer Wu Yue. So we understand Bitcoin as a decentralized currency that escaped from the governance of nation governance. Its physical infrastructure is still very centralized and massive. Bitcoin mines usually are consisted of large number of mining hardware, which ferociously consumes electricity. So the desire for cheap electricity and cheap land become the primary concern for cost control. Then we can see from the map on the left, priorities for Bitcoin mines start from the accessibility to low price electricity, then natural cooling infrastructure, low land price, and less urbanization. And then the local policy supports, and the last one is internet speed. In this way, the rural countryside in Sichuan then become an ideal location for Bitcoin mines, where hydraulic project provides electricity and natural cooling. When water level becomes low, the mines will be transported to Xinjiang province, where wind energy continue to provide electricity and natural cooling. So on the right, we can see some screenshot from artist Liu Chuang's work. And he has noticed that the nomadic routes of Bitcoin mines overlap with the ethnic minorities groups who still preserve their nomadic lifestyle, indigenous rituals. The arrival of Bitcoin mines adds complexity to local logistics, work division, and even sound profile. So we can see from those screenshots, the artist just opposed the noise created by the mining hardwares, natural sound of water, music and sounds by indigenous people, and even the sound from atomic bombs and voices from the outer space. And there are a few more photos that we has incorporated in our archival material in the exhibits. So those are the photos that shows the Bitcoin mines in the Sichuan province and the miners within those hardwares. So from a brief introduction of the exhibit, we want to point out in this tidal currents, we want to see the conversion of water resource and how it becomes an energy to power the Bitcoin mines, and how does the arrival of Bitcoin mines that change the local logistic and work division in Sichuan province within this ethnic minority groups. And then we're gonna hand our screen to Professor Parikka. We're gonna start with his introduction on the geology of media and the natural history of logistics.
Hi, thank you very much. Let me try to see if this
Yes, also can I
works.
jump in?
Yes.
That's
You're breaking up a bit.
Yeah.
Because Parikka has other projects around especially from originate from we both we bring Professor Parikka who works a lot on that. So it's really pleasant and that he can share some crazy and brilliant ideas. And I think we can watch and see how.
Great much. Is it okay if I share my screen now?
Yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
If it's very helpful that you have the translation, let me try to do it from here as well. And then I'll, everything works. How about now?
Yeah.
Seems to work, right?
Yeah, it works well.
Excellent. So you should see slides. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be already listening to your introduction about the exhibition. It was amazing. I wish I could as well. I know some projects, but I know more about it. In the discussion, we can find lots of interconnections between, I'm going to say, and your wonderfully rich exhibition and artworks and design works there. But of course, first thing I want to say is a massive thank you for having me. Thanks to our curators and our organizers for all the work that you put together for the exhibition, but also thanks for having me talk about my work. As requested, I will briefly talk about some of the key ideas in my book, in my work on Geology of Media, a book that came out some years ago. I think it actually came out the same year as Benjamin Bratton's The Stack in 2015. But it's still, Geology of Media still features in a lot of the work I do, both writing and theoretical work and teaching as well, including some of the work that I do at Strelka Institute's terraforming program as mentioned. So I'm sort of hoping that at least in the discussion, I'd be able to talk more about those contexts of both the artworks in themselves, theoretical concepts, but also then perhaps institutional work of pedagogy and setting up certain, let's say, interdisciplinary research institutes or think tanks, as they like to call it at Strelka as well. So that's going to be something of a key thing, especially also, of course, as Strelka, many Strelka researchers' work is part of the exhibition. So there will be interesting parallel tracks in terms of how to approach our topics today, which of course is pretty much the key topic is, as said already about your exhibition, about the exhibition at OCAT in Beijing, is about entanglement of natural elements and technological infrastructures. And perhaps in ways, I want to also, in positive ways, problematize what it means to refer to natural elements and see things, as you also suggested, in more interesting ways than reproduction of binaries of nature and culture. And perhaps also pick up on terms, even earlier terms from the legacy of feminist theory. For example, terms such as nature cultures by Donna Haraway, and how it feeds into this continuum of thinking about materialities across nature, technology, data, energy, and multiple other sorts of really interesting, complex infusions and layers. What I propose is that I'm going to run through some context of what is what is geology of media, how I understand it, why it makes sense to talk of geophysics of media culture, how it relates to some of the concerns of the exhibition, as well as recent themes in both scholarly work, but also design and art. And this is why perhaps this terminology might make sense as one insight to technological culture, both in architectural terms, broadly understood, and in terms of what we consider media in a very expanded mode. This is not perhaps the traditional media studies and communication studies, but something that starts to speak to planetary infrastructure. A lot of the things I say I've been doing is, of course, in close dialogue with Bratton's work. I'm also very much happy to find other sort of resonances when we discuss these things as well, including to some of the concepts that I mentioned. I like to think of the book itself, and not just this book, but every book I do, as a platform itself. Platform in the sense that it hopefully enables further developments, further research, further ideas, both artistic work and design work as well, about energy and media, space and spatiality. The point example was just mentioned is a wonderful example. And then the links between digital culture and architecture, and other points of contact where media theory is relevant to contemporary art practice, contemporary curatorial practice, like our exhibition we're talking about, as well as some other disciplines such as indeed architecture and urbanism as well. My book grows out of media theory and my own work in media theory. Some of that will be mentioned, but it also has become connected to a variety of discussions in relation to that key term of planetarity of technology as such. That is an interesting theme because of the implications about scale. At which scale do we theorize, and at which scale do we design? At which scale do we conceptualize? From the soil level to geological time scales, technological culture becomes something that is defined also then by these seemingly natural elements, but in ways of how they become integrated into logistics of indeed, for instance, supply chains, as well as many aesthetic elements, not just art, but aesthetic elements in terms of perception and how we describe, for instance, the notion of the image. And of course, a lot of this is really relevant besides in the exhibition, but also in the span of multiple years of what has been happening in a lot of artistic and design work. And again, the notion of the scale becomes interesting in terms of artistic work that thinks beyond the human scale, to put it in sort of certain terms as well. For instance, including atmospheric processes, air, into its consideration as well. Of course, it's not only recent years that there would be an art history of air across past 100 years at least. One way to understand this book as well is to think of perhaps in terms such as the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze spoke about. What is the problem that the book tries to pose? What is the key problem that the book articulates, and how it proposes this idea about the geology of media? Not just that it provides a solution, but it provides a framework through which certain problems start to make sense. And it is indeed this sort of a problem of non-anthropocentric knowing about media processes that still incorporate a lot of key things that we feel important for questions of social justice, for instance, as well, as in a way was hinted at earlier as well. It also sits as part of, I'll mention this really briefly only, we can return to these topics later as well. Geology of media sits as part of my earlier work, it's a third part of the so-called media ecology trilogy of books. That sounds a bit grandiose, but I ended up writing this trilogy of books that all of it deals with how nature is incorporated into contemporary technologies. So included a book on computer viruses and the broader viral culture that I wrote earlier, which is not merely about computer viruses. And of course, in the contemporary planetary epidemic context, there's a lot there that I wrote about viral culture since 1980s as a key theme that defined of how we relate to bodies human, bodies viral, and bodies technological. And I continued some of these themes in the next book of the so-called trilogy called Insect Media, which was a book about also non-human aspects of media theory. We can talk about insect media later as well, because main focus now is geology of media, which is continuing these themes of what does it specify in technological work culture in relation to questions of duration and time? What is the geological time scale and why is it interesting and relevant? The short answer is because of the climate change catastrophe in, and also various other ways of about technical media culture slightly differently as well. So it grew out of geology of media, grew out of my interest, how we can theorize and make sense. This is one key theme, and I want to point to it as well. How we can make sense. I hope the slides are changing, by the way. How we can make sense of electronic waste. This was an early theme where I started developing some of the insights to geology of media. How we can make sense of electronic waste as part of the long tail of digital culture, which seems a quite specific and particular research topic itself, but actually can be seen also as a helpful way of articulating how themes of use, scale, and time, and even history of media can be approached in new ways. And this is a theme that is not obviously invented by me at all. It works at the back of a lot of really interesting work, including Chinese science fiction like Waste Tide, a wonderful work itself that deals with similar topics. Electronic waste as one way, or there's multiple ways of understanding of what we mean by digital materiality, and how this can be a central piece of how we understand the impact and the effects of technologies as toxins, as concrete toxins, or bioaccumulative toxins, having an effect on air, water, soil, but also, again, a theme that is part of Waste Tide, the novel, laboring bodies that work with waste, right? So that's a super interesting theme in itself, and there's I like to think of this as well. That there's a parallel between waste and geology of media. I've been mentioning a couple of times the notion of history and time, and I want to elaborate a bit more of that, partly because my own background, I was trained originally as a historian, a cultural historian, and I have this persistent interest in thinking both histories of contemporary technological culture and how questions of history and time persist in the contemporary context. Often digital culture, cultures of new technologies, are described as amnesiac. In other words, as if suffer from a memory, that they recognize history, they write themselves as if the only time scale that matters is future and the time of the new and the innovation. But for me, I'm interested always in all of my work, even if the topics are different, I'm interested in complex notions of time and how time is embedded and active or material in objects or even infrastructures of media, which are circulating time This is a bit philosophical, circulating time, but also they are themselves temporal objects in many ways. My leading question that was in my head in writing Geology of Media was then, if this topic that we're dealing with, electronic waste, but also other themes that I'll mention soon, if this is not anymore history, what is it? What is the obsolete, the discarded? What is waste? That is not merely media history, but something else. And also, what does the existence of these massive amounts of discarded electronic and other technological material do to our sense of media history as such? Media history that we most often think of as things in our grandparents' attics, old radios, or tidied up in science museums or media museums as such. What is this other sort of a media quotation mark history as waste that is discarded onto landscapes? And not just waste, but also a temporal way of understanding infrastructures and the ways in which they, for instance, relate to big questions like energy and energy infrastructures, right? So you can start to see that there's these multiple angles of materiality, energy, time. It's partly philosophical, but partly very concrete in relation to lived environments and landscapes of labor. That is not merely anymore about media as we use it as gadgets, but media as we don't use materials. So electronic waste is indeed a case in point. Discarded or dysfunctional, I'm just going to check where we are, okay. Discarded or dysfunctional electronics are more interesting than merely as waste. A theorization of obsolete electronics becomes an exercise in speculative future history. What is the electronic waste layer that is the future fossil to be excavated in 10,000 years, in 5,000 years, in 500 years already, and how this implies not just speculative future histories of earthly territories, but contemporary logistics. How electronic trash, electronic waste is not just dead media fallen out of use, active part in waste trade, governance, international relations, extraction of valuable materials from waste, uneven global economic relations, also cultures of fixing, cultures of repairing that speak about design and media design in more interesting ways than developing new things. So there's something interesting in the notion of repair. And of course, parallel to my work is the whole big field of repair studies as well, of how to a different approach. And we could continue with multiple other angles to it as well, also in terms of urbanism as well. For instance, what does all of this imply in terms of geographical and urban development to consider waste as part of zoning, literally and also quite broadly, both chemical and economic zoning as well. I want to also mention that a lot of this work emerged from collaboration. So I'm always interested in collaborative and collective work. In this case, a lot of it was inspired through a collaboration with critical designer Garnet Hertz, who's now in Vancouver. We worked on the idea of zombie media, which is a peculiar, weird term, but it felt useful in that context as well. Zombie media that relates to planned obsolescence. I forgot to put that on the slides, and I don't know how to, perhaps there's a good translation, but planned obsolescence, we can also check translation terms later as well, perhaps on the chat. planned obsolescence of electronic culture, of these failures that are designed as part of our technological tools. And it defines a particular attitude, things that are breaking down. And that relates indeed to an underlying attitude in design culture. So we wanted to talk about all of electronic culture, of gadgets and such, not merely as dead media that is unusable and discarded, but as zombie media, in the sense zombie from, zombie films and whatnot, living deads that are not just dead, but they continue their afterlife as toxic materials, media that becomes toxic materials, but also can be remined for metals and materials, while itself it becomes a toxic hazard in soil and air, as I mentioned as well. So zombie media is a key term that we talked about in that work. I talked about in this book as well. So you might be already wondering that, all these terms and such, what purpose do they serve? And it's one way of how I maneuver through these complex materialities, of trying to think them conceptually as well, because concepts help in this understanding these complex layered realities as well. And in one way, my book is an attempt to remind that we need an alternative vocabulary for digital culture, to shift from the idea that we're dealing with immaterial information culture to considering how technologies, from interfaces to large-scale infrastructures, are defined by their materiality. And it's also the spatialized, temporal thing that makes it interesting, the materiality of technological forms that relates to territories, it relates to architectures and zones, but also temporal periods and histories as well. And a lot of the work that I do is trying to think through the notion of materiality, right? Materiality of, I'm just checking where I am in terms of what I wrote in my slides. Materiality of technology, and the wave of new work over the past 15, 20 years at least of new materialism, of intensive relations between multiple kinds of bodies, human bodies and non-human bodies, atmospheric elements, technological infrastructures, and more. And I try to specify constantly what I mean by materiality by various terms. It doesn't mean in itself anything. We need to specify it constantly. So I'm going to run through a couple of key concepts now as well to help to underline what I mean by both geology of media and what I mean by materiality, right? And these might be so interesting hooks or themes that we can return to later as well. So I'll kind of run through key concepts in this sense. And we already mentioned, in a way, one key concept or invention in this sense was zombie media. But another one that is quite central to this work, and not just my work, is deep time of media, deep time both as it emerges in geological literature, but also how it's been adapted to media studies and art studies as well. So deep time of the media. Already media theorist Siegfried Zielinski, and I can't remember whether Zielinski has been translated into Chinese. I'm not sure, we can talk about that later, but Siegfried Zielinski mobilized the idea of a long, deep time of media history. And he adopted the term deep time from geological literature to describe media culture and media history. He was interested in deep time interactions of art, science, and technology. And he's been promoting projects that mapped also of deep times outside the usual Western histories of media, In other words, there's an interesting series called Variantology, where they are dedicated to different regions of deep times of art media technology. One of them features deep times of Chinese media and scientific history. Another one is South America. Another one is on Middle East. So these are really interesting research projects in themselves. But I did something slightly different with my use of deep time. I wanted to think of deep time literally in the sense that there is an actual geological history and geological relevance to advanced media technologies. I wanted to ask of what is the deep time of those minerals and energy that define technological culture. And this way, computer history and technological history becomes Earth history through the fact that our machines run on rare earth minerals, fossil fuels still, and plastics among other materials and metals. So again, as was mentioned earlier, Benjamin Patton's work about the stack. One of the layers of the stack is the earth layer. And my book can be also seen as a sort of an elaboration of what Benjamin would call the earth layer of the stack. I do it slightly differently, but there's a clear and close resonance with his notion as well. But I want to also run through the ways in which this earth layer is full of various kinds of practices, including neo-colonial practices that do not operate only that, there's a whole theme of extraction industries of minerals and mining of minerals that becomes part of how we understand media, but also indeed by way of discarding of waste. And we can model through this idea of deep time a radical angle to geopolitics, in the sense that it's really about the geo of geopolitics. In other words, the geological affordances, minerals, and implications of advanced technologies, both in relation to what is called extraction industries, and extraction, which is proposed nowadays as a term to understand technical media culture. But I want to understand extraction in quite literal terms of extraction of materials, minerals, that is very closely related to the histories of colonialism. So there's a whole media history of extraction of 500-600 years at least, but also which builds, and this is quite speculative, but think of it as philosophical statement as well. It builds on millions of years of media history. In other words, media histories that relate to histories of fossilization for fossil fuels, but also histories of minerals and earth materials. A key term, and this is, I again, hats off to translators in terms of finding the terms, especially because we're dealing with terms that are invented terms, but for the sake of the complexity of these issues as well. One key term that is proposed in the book is media nature as one word. Media natures as a way of describing this link of media technologies and natural resource earth histories. Already in feminist literature of science and technology studies, Donna Haraway was early on proposing to replace this division, the binary division that is often central part of Western cosmology of nature and culture, by way of a composite term of nature culture, which perhaps resonates quite interestingly in the exhibition theme as well. Nature cultures as a fluid continuum across what we think of as the artificial, and what is defined as natural. This is there would be an interesting discussion, and we can continue on this later as well, of how this relates to the broader research fields of post-anthropocentric humanities or post-humanities, where we ask questions like, what are the forms of power that emerge in regards to this intensive exploitation of earth resources? while we are faced with the need for a radical transformation of infrastructures, such as fossil fuel infrastructures. How to maneuver this complex situation by keeping these multiple, juggling balls in of material exploitation, material needs, social justice, etc., etc. In this context, I propose to think of media technologies as media natures. That media are both defined by access and use of these earth materials, rare earth minerals and but also that media in the broad sense, like remote sensing, are instrumental in our understanding of what the earth is. As materials, as territory, as elementals of not, usually the Greek elements are mentioned of air, fire, water, earth, but we can also replace those with more complex cosmologies of elementals as well than just a Greek legacy at all. So quite concretely, when we are thinking about technological development, this could be seen to relate to remote sensing technologies as well, used in Earth observation or various forms of specialist imaging. Military imaging would be one, but also environmental monitoring. Those would be great examples. This defines a very particular way of understanding of what is our understanding of the Earth as a mediatized set of images and data and whatnot. Quite often when we are talking about these things, we refer to the first photographs from outside the planet, 60s and 70s, including the famous 1970s blue marble image as well, of seeing the planet itself as an object outside for the first, human history being, seen very differently when we start actually seeing the planet from the outside. But I would say that besides the symbolically very important images, there's a whole, I would say, more interesting question of remote sensing as a way of looking for resources, etc., as part of questions of mining and military, environmental monitoring. This is where I kind of realized that I think I'm missing a slide. I'm sorry, I don't think I've got it. Yes, I don't, but I'll mention it now and we can add it to the chat. One example of super interesting work is, of course, as an infrastructure project, the Digital Belt and Road Initiative as well in its massive scale, and also the wonderful work by the artist duo GeoCinema, who worked on a film and installation projects related to Digital Belt and Road, and how that frames our understanding of Earth. And their project is called Framing Territories as well. So it might be an interesting thing to discuss, also because part of their work was staying in Beijing and working with some historical sources, doing interesting interviews at the Science Academy in Beijing, and working on this with specialists in relation to the questions of remote sensing. I think I'm also missing another slide, unfortunately, from here, which should have been, and I'll just do the following. I'm just going to,
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe it's my fault. Maybe you can just share your original slides if you want, so you can open the original one without
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and then I'm going to check if I can share the other one. It's not a big deal if it's missing, but let's see.
You can just share the image so that I can. I think that audience can also understand through those excellent images.
Exactly. Just show this brief share screen. I'll do this again. Let's see. I think it's this one. Let's see if this works. I think it works now, right?
Yeah, good.
So this is what I was mentioning as well. GeoCinema's work on the Chinese Digital Belt and Road Initiative and their work called Framing Territories is relates in many ways, to these themes as well. So I wanted to bring that to play. Then I want to mention this as well, and this is unfortunately not now translated, but we can work on translations of the term, and it might be one of those super difficult terms to translate. I don't know how I translate into Chinese, but we can figure it out. And I'm aware of time as well, so I'll leave some of the things I'm going to say for discussion later, but I'll run through a couple of things more before we move on to the next section. So in addition to media nature, in addition to deep time and zombie media, a key term that I found useful, I think it featured also in your introduction, although you mentioned psychogeography, is psychogeophysics, which relates to the fact that artistic projects and some design projects and architectural projects, but mostly artistic projects, play a key role in my approach and in my book. Oh, we got a translation now, thank you. They're not only treated all as art history, art critique. I want to think of the various art projects that I talk about in the book. They provide one form of a methodological inspiration in putting what I talk about in theory, in theoretical and conceptual terms, into artistic and curatorial contexts as well. In other words, how working with metals, chemicals, infrastructures of technology become experiments in what media is as dynamic material. So geology of media in this sense is about experimentation with materials and how they relate to subjectivity and physical landscapes and territories and modes of planetarity as well. And psychogeophysics, of course, in a way refers to the more famous term of psychogeography, which comes from art theory and art practice of situationists in 1950s and especially 1960s, Guy Debord, the French situationist, and others who were interested in mapping these, as I think it was already defined by our curators early on, mapping these interrelations between landscapes and urban landscapes. Quite often it is the case of psychogeography, and ways in which we experience and how it affects our psychological and other modes of subjectivity as well. But in past years also, the term psychogeophysics has been proposed, and you can see what it does. It moves from the idea that psychogeography is more urban and more focused on cities to planetary scale impact, planetary scale processes of how they impact how we think about notions of the subject, experience, but also design. So there's something again about the concept of scale. How do we move in cultural theory, media theory, but also design theory and design practice, broadly understood, to these scales which are relevant in different scales than just the urban, if that makes sense. And this is not being dismissive of our colleagues in urbanism, but building on their wonderful work that exists already. And of course, one can read the psychogeophysics in relation to a lot of the themes that are part of the exhibition at OCAT in Beijing. Works that deal with technological ways of understanding Earth dynamics, but also how those dynamics are themselves a condition of existence for media technologies. In other words, there is no media without there being an Earth of minerals and materials, of electromagnetism and whatnot. This is not to naturalize technology, but to think of how it's already entangled in how geophysical forces are part of the so-called cultural sphere, and what are the adequate terms to understand this entanglement. But also, like we can talk about later, what are, for instance, the forms of imaging visual imaging and non-visual forms of expression that can talk about this complex geophysical reality in which we live in and in which our advanced technologies lives in as well. I might switch back to, let's see, I might switch back to the other slide for a second. So give me a second. It's got translations. So give me just a second because I'm going to finish soon and we can continue with other things. I think it was this one. Sorry if I got the wrong one now. Oh, sorry, I think I shared again the wrong one. I'm gonna second. The other one. It must be then this.
Don't worry, just take your time. We can all understand.
Yes, for some reason I seem to be constantly picking the wrong one, which is funny and not funny.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just do the translation of terminology on the chat box.
That's very helpful because it's itself. Yeah, I don't know why I'm getting all the time the wrong one. I'm gonna one more time to get one. I think now gonna be succeeding. It's two of these versions. Now I think the right one. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. And at this point, I've been talking longer than I was meaning to, way much longer than I was meaning to. So I'm going to do a really brief couple of notes and leave some of the things I was planning to talk now, we can leave for our discussion. Okay. So one thing I just wanted to mention briefly that, okay, those are a lot of the key terms around which the book itself focuses on questions that are relevant for the exhibition. And of course, I've continued this in different ways. One was a short book called A Slow Technological Violence, where I really wanted to think through what is the notion of damage in relation to environments, in relation to technological culture, where I again talk about deep times, but also in relation to artistic projects like the architect and speculative architect Liam Young's work, and Unknown Field Division is an architectural studio whose work I talked about there as well. And slow violence is a term that comes from a thinker called Rob Nixon. So I kind of immobilized some of that later as well. And I was also thinking that as part of my presentation, I would then move to demonstrate or show what are the relations of geology of media and my work there to what I've been doing more recently, this year actually, still when it was in February, I was in Moscow at Strelka Institute, and how this feeds into my teaching with the Strelka Institute. But I actually think that we could leave this for later, and because we're going to later talk about some current projects. So perhaps I'm going to stop now. We can have a conversation and questions, and then we can return to some of these topics that are on the slide about Strelka in our conversation. Would that work?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, we can save operative images to our next part of conversation.
Exactly, because I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, and thank you so much for make it easy to understand for our Chinese audiences. And you explain many things pretty well and accompanied with the translation. So yeah, if there's any questions that our audience want to raise to Professor Parikka, you guys can write it in the chat box, and we'll have people to note those questions, and we'll save them for the QA session in the end. Yeah. So
exactly.
So Jussi, do you want to start with some questions with the theory, and I can follow with design and urbanism?
Thank you so much. And for me, I'm more on theories and just quick.
I think you're breaking up a bit.
Concept.
Connection is breaking.
Say you are breaking up. So
okay, right now maybe you can hear me.
Yeah, it's a
I
bit better
use
now
the
with the.
video is
Okay.
better.
Yeah, I just find myself behind the video. Okay. So thank you so much for this excellent talk. And I'm just wondering, there is one question about the zombie media. I'm just wondering the concept of zombie media, because you said that zombie media is a kind of leveling up of that media, and which is really different from that media, and it can be reused. So it's just like those digital materials can be reused and just from the ground to the laboratory places. Maybe that from my point of view, zombie media is flexible and it's quite energetic. So how would you explain that? Because one of my friends thinks of that zombie media is a status that between that and life, which that means so I just want to re-explain the concept of zombie media to make it clear. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, I'm happy to talk about that. Because and this might be interesting to anyone like you as well, with a special interest in theory and concepts. I think also concepts often as they are situated in particular practices. In other words, concepts that work by way of abstractions can sometimes resonate closely with particular concrete practices, human practices as well. And in this case, one key practice, an artistic or design practice as well, and this is, again, thank you to Garnet Hertz, was circuit bending. So the sort of a like DIY practice of fixing and repurposing broken or discarded electronics, and that way giving them an afterlife. So it was very concrete, sort of a like tinkering practice that he's an expert in, and he's elaborated in his own work as well. But we also want to play with this. So what is indeed the afterlife, and the sort of like between, if the life of media is often defined by the ways in which we use media. In other words, whether it's a mobile culture, or whether it's other sorts of digital cultures, gaming cultures, whatnot. What is then, my question was then, what is the culture of not using, of abandoned media that is not anymore of use? And that's where it switches to dead media, so to speak. So dead media was a term that was already in 1990s used by science fiction writer Bruce Sterling, to refer to this idea that we should catalog and list all the media technologies that have fallen out of use across different periods, from the telegraph to old television to rotary telephone and whatnot, and so forth. But our proposal was to continue on this, indeed, in relation to the afterlife of media as well. And for me, the more interesting thing also, not perhaps more interesting, but the more urgent thing is indeed this idea that what are media as something that is materially toxic because of the ways in which they've been designed in relation to particular materials and such as well. So the toxicity of media, and not just digital media, but broadly speaking, electronic media. Think of old TV screens from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, computer screens, and multiple other forms. They're weird sort of chemical objects in themselves as well. So zombie media was a way of starting to talk about everything else than the human use of media. And it became for me a way to also propose things like, what is chemistry of media? What are chemical reactions of media technologies that are usually mostly for engineering and expert uses? And how do we theorize those in a meaningful way from humanities perspective? So from humanities perspective, then it becomes a question indeed of, for instance, environmental violence, or what those toxic media do to bodies, and how they impact bodies, but also soil And how do we then deal with this from the point of view of design and theorization of design? And then one key term that was talked about was indeed planned obsolescence. And in that article, we also wrote, and it's part of Geology of Media, on zombie media, it's the key term is planned obsolescence, of how obsolescence of media dying is already inserted into design, but also, of course, sort of a like marketing and broader circulation of desires about media technologies as well. And we know this from the culture of the upgrade, for instance, upgrading mobiles, upgrading whatnot as well. So there's an inner logic that we want to unfold the other way around as well, in terms of how to unfold the culture of the upgrade to something else. And then we felt that the notion of the zombie as this sort of a amusing and funny figure, but also aptly persistently toxic, is relevant here as well. Does that make sense? What do you think? Is there?
Yeah,
about
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And as I can get this notion, I think you're talking about that the media is not only the media itself, but it's a media and objects in the social milieu, in the social surrounding, like, and so we probably the key term, the key purpose to do the research on zombie media is to find alternative surrounding and alternative way of using media. So it's really excellent. And I can think about the concept of individualization from Simondon, and which is also probably have a similarity with zombie media. And he tried to separate digital objects itself and talk about how the materiality in digital objects can be reused by human, and how can those human activity relate to digital objects or like electronic media. Thank you so much. And I also thank you. Yeah.
I was just thinking that because you mentioned the key word, sorry to this, because I was the digital object is interesting in this regard as well. I want to add briefly is because of there would be, and especially because you mentioned Simondon and it's very apt, there would be a whole interesting discussion, a longer discussion, probably a separate one as well, about what is the digital object. There's a wonderful work by philosophers like QiWu, who has worked on the digital object, of course, and based on Simondon as well, and trying to articulate what is the notion of the object, the digital object, in relation to data and data environments and modes of abstraction. But then it works the other way around. And that's the peculiar thing about, for me, about the digital object, if we use that as a term, is how it folds and unfolds into directions. It folds in relation to abstractions and data, which are as real as the material existence of any digital object. So this duality, which is not duality, but this sort of entanglement of data and materialities is, of course, what is at stake in all of this, and what makes it a superbly interesting philosophical but also material problem. So apologies, you can continue.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for your supplement, because actually I am quite interested in the works of QiWu, and I just follow his pathway to do media studies, and so I totally understand what you are talking about, and I totally understand the way that you say entanglement, because for human and objects, not something like dualism or something opposition, but something like interaction, and in a kind of from Chinese philosophy, philosophical terminologies like yin yang. So it's like the relation between, like, the relation in dynamic process. Maybe it's too abstract, but I think you can understand. So that if we bring this philosophical view to media studies, we can find that there is no absolute ontology or in sense of digital object, but a kind of objects in surrounding. So
Yes.
yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I think that's a really interesting theme again for who's really especially interested exactly in these philosophical and contemporary philosophical ways of understanding it. I think that also points nicely to the definition of the broad field, and of course there's different voices and philosophers in there, but new materialism, especially as it pertains to understanding of what is the reality of relations, just material objects in themselves, but the materiality of and reality of relations in which those objects are embedded in milieus, in environments, and defined by those relations as well. So it's super interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think I got a last question that I will just give it to Yishen, because you mentioned new materialism. So I just think of Triplo, object-oriented object-oriented ontology, right? And I'm really interested in that because something it came up like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, forgot. And it's not so new, and it was meanwhile, Manu Delanda also looks at the relation between human and nature, and I find there are some probably differences between Triplo and Delanda's theory, because Delanda, from my perspective, he looks at human in a natural ecosystem, which means I think it's more close to Zhuangzi's QiWu. Like the equality of all things is not something like object-oriented or anthropocentric, but a kind of balance or equilibrium between human and nature. And at least in his first book published in 1997, I guess. And how do you think of his work? How do you relate his work to Triplo or some new materialism?
That's super interesting. So I've been myself so involved in especially the work of new materialism, and for me one thing that I'm interested in is I think that even if they speak about or they try to pose similar problems, object-oriented ontology and new materialism, I think those are two different things, and I'll explain why I think so as well, but they resonate in ways that is super interesting that you pointed out. A lot of the terminology of new materialism emerges, as you said, with Manuel Delanda's work in 1990s, which is to me the most interesting one, because it was still very much embedded in particular problems of architecture, histories of military technologies, and then the sort of a non-linear way of understanding history from the point of view of geology, but also, for instance, language. So, but besides Delanda, the other key figure from where new materialism or the term emerges in 1990s is the Deleuzian material feminist philosopher Rosi Braidotti. So it's really, to me, the pole of Delanda and Delanda's mobilization of Deleuzian ontologies in relation to architectural formations and spatial and these radical temporalities that he's talking about. And then differently, but still resonating, Rosi Braidotti's way of understanding, ways of understanding subjectivity in terms of its relational materiality, and then what she's developed later as critical post-humanities, as this radical entry of how do we think about questions of the non-human, but so that it's aware of all the work and all the political histories that are important, of histories of gender, colonialism, and other sort of questions that are important for posing issues of justice as well. So I think there's an interesting different lineage here that is slightly posed in different terms than object-oriented ontology. And for me, for instance, Delanda was, besides Braidotti, Delanda was close because of the work in 1990s, because it was talking about how do we deal with questions of time and temporality and history in his book of non-linear, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. And it was a big inspiration for my geology of media as well, because it stretched the ontological question of non-human durations and temporalities, but placed it in certain scientific contexts of, for instance, geology, or how do we understand urbanism, for instance, through this perspective as well. So there was a lot there that played with this, again, this sort of a continuum between concrete historical relevant themes, but also then modes of abstraction that are necessary for us to understand different modalities of perception than just the human, right? So there's something there that I find important as an investment. I also want to work with as in those terms as well. Let me think if there's something else that I wanted to mention. I think new materialism, I was, me and not just me, but we, colleagues organized one of the early new materialism conferences in Europe in 2009, I think it was. And where we invited people, we were then reading a lot of contemporary philosophers and thinkers like Adrian Mackenzie and Luciana Parisi and others as well. So it was then still, I think, at Goldsmiths as well, like where you also studied then. As ways of understanding exactly questions of technology. So that was for me an important impulse as well. What does this body of work do to our understanding of philosophy of technology and technological abstractions? And I'm happy to discuss more about this, but this is the brief version of what I think about it.
No, thank you. Maybe we can talk later, Benabe. And thank you so much for mentioning urbanism and urban design. And I think Ishan has so many things to say about that. Probably
yes.
do you have any ideas about that, Ishan?
Very expert than I am, because I'm not trained as an architect. I'm more like always enjoying the company of architects and landscape architects and urbanists.
Yeah, I'm really interested, like when you talk about the relation between the damaged environment and technologies, and it made me think of like how we can employ natural process as a strategy that we can use in the governance, repairing, and healing. You have also mentioned that that our understanding of this media and natural history can assist in our urban design and even earth design, like a planetary design on a larger scale.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to briefly mention like 2 projects that we have incorporated in our exhibits. So one is the sky that comes from Earth, and I think probably you're also familiar with the scientific project in Iceland, which has a similar to the sky, to bear the sky. Yeah, that's actually the name of that project from Strelka. Yeah, they collect the carbon dioxide from the air and put it back into the deep ground. And the carbon dioxide mixed with water in the basalt and then convert to the air. They convert from air to solids in the deep ground within a very short time. So I think like 40% of the air convert in like 4 months in the experiments that's done in Iceland, and almost like 90% of them have done conversion in the span of 2 years. So it kind of employed this natural reaction process as a way of recycle the carbon from the air and become like a healing process, and it's much more effective than the passive technology. And for me, like it has like a similar framework with the brownfield repairing, because we have a lot of post-industrial cities that have brownfield which has been toxicated from the industrial plants from the 19th century. And some landscape design will create a vibrant ecosystem that may heal this land to make it suitable for dwelling, like in few years. Like for example, that Bill Gates and the Melinda Foundation, they built in Seattle. They have like a very well-designed landscape design and a swamp in this piece of land to recycle some of the toxic material left from the post-industrial plants before. So one of the questions is that I want to probably hear you elaborate more of how these natural processes can become part of our strategy in the zoning, in the governance, in the repairing, and also you mentioned it can also inform us when we make the zoning law. And I don't know if you have experience the work with government, because to stipulate the zoning law, it has like bureaucratic process that we need to go through, and it's a long process to kind of to educate, to inform, and so that's the geological formation. So not only in the design part, but also in the urban design and the bureaucracy of urban design. That's maybe that you can elaborate more on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great question, but it's also just the limit of my expertise as well. So I'm going to be very careful in not speculating with too many things I don't know exactly about, especially because of the specialist terrain of particular bureaucratic modes of defining zones as well. So there's a whole in itself a mediation that is the bureaucratic mediation that is crucial for these aspects. There's something interesting in ways of, and this is question exactly of, on the one hand, actual actionable plans for particular projects, and then what is the status of projects that are able to project, you know, in a bit more free form artistic or design or speculative design fashion, particular modes of futurity, for instance, through carbon capture and whatnot as well. And what are the interfaces between the two? And that's, to me, an interesting question, because it relates to pedagogical and then institutional questions of how do we incorporate particularly useful projects that are more speculative into their interface. What are the modes of translation, so to speak, through which they become meaningful for the bureaucratic process? Because otherwise we'll risk you know, them a long tail of really interesting projects that have no significance for things that would actually be helpful for particular ways of rezoning as well. But what they are useful as well, obviously already, and this is where a lot of humanities comes in useful as well, is to understand what is the historical and contemporary forms of relating to territories through such legal means, but also means of rights in a broader sense and justice in a broader sense, that has been at the back of extraction industries already displacing a lot of indigenous people and lands. And then how do we ensure that we don't reproduce that when we are dealing with carbon capture and forms of sort of a certain planetary territory for carbon capture as well? And what are the questions of how do we, on which levels of governance and decision making can these be implemented in ways that is aware of these difficult histories as well, in relation, for instance, indigenous lands, but also many other sorts of questions, social justice. So I think there's something interesting there as well, that on the one hand, there are specialist terrains of how do we think about zones and zoning and urbanism and zoning of waste territories that is done, for instance, already in context of nuclear waste, for instance, right? But then also how this can be related, as said, to this sort of a legacy of historical and contemporary work across different, you know, humanities design fields as well. And I think that the trick is not just to come up with what is the best solution, but how to come up with such frameworks in which the humanities and other knowledge can become meaningful, right? And on a scale that is meaningful as well. So there's something interesting in terms of, for instance, like you said, what is the mode of understanding natural processes that becomes meaningful, and how to incorporate, for instance, contemporary forms of through thinking abstractions such as data in ways that do not reproduce modes of violence that have been done to certain territories, but are actually helpful in thinking beyond the usual timescales and thinking about long-term timescales of, for instance, planning as well, but with very much an understanding of questions of social justice, if that makes sense. So while I'm not able to answer the more specific questions, and I leave it to specialists like you, who know much, much more about urbanism and architecture, I think there's something interesting in how we think about the different knowledge base and how to combine these so that they become meaningful, right? What do you think? Is this the direction that is interesting, or would you?
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting when you mention related to territory. There's like legal rights pertain to the territory, and not only those who use this part of the land or construct on the land, but also like nature. And we can also maybe discuss the sovereignty of nature, because when we plant something there, the nature sort of they govern the land, and they definitely rule this region, and it's not easily being tamed and regulated by the human force, even though we can calculate and manipulate. So I think like in part of like this landscape design and use this as a process to heal the land is there is like a dynamic between us, between the human and the people who pertain right to the land, that want to construct, build, and tame the land and the nature, which like we can let them to grow and create their own ecosystem. And in this way, like I want to like bring out another question that related to indigenous culture, because like to some extent, people from the past or these ethnic groups who has still pertain their ritualistic habits from the past may have like different wisdom than us and those modern technologies. So one project that we have incorporated in the exhibition is called the Water System Refuge. And this video art installation look at how the ethnic minority group in called Qiang and how they cope with water hazard in Southeast China. And there's also like a water conservancy project that's being left by the Soviet aid project in the last century, which was proven wasn't running really well. So this our project, it raised a question on the refuge, because like refuge is kind of a modern term, like also defined as a modern term when we consider the water hazard. When we do not consider the water hazard as a natural process that we need to cope with that, or we need to live with that, but as something that we need to tame and regulate, and get it under our control. So that project was questioning the concept of refuge, and to ask that how can we think of refuge as a more effective term in the Anthropocene, so it will assist us to have like more effective strategies when we want to repair, heal, and govern.
Yeah. So the project sounds fantastic. It's probably exactly those kinds of projects are exactly the ones that are helpful in trying to combine the different sorts of affordances of different disciplinary perspectives and perspectives to governance as well. On the one hand, you mentioned earlier as well, in terms of, we were talking about remote sensing as well, that one could think the multiple kinds of sensing that are meaningful in a bundle when we define whether it's particular uses for a particular land or particular territory, from indigenous knowledge and its historical basis to technological remote sensing systems, and trying to see of how these things match or don't match. And then on the other hand as well, I think, and this is where a lot of work by friends in critical legal theory are doing and constantly reminding about, is that questions of their sovereignty in relation to these issues needs to be dealt with in relation to not just questions of human rights, but also property rights as well. So there's a lot to be said about the particular legal frameworks and how they can be made and are in some cases recognizing multiple histories of, if we use the word sovereignty, that is beyond the nation state, and how does it sort of work with those different systems and their historical layers as well. So of course, and there's, this is just where to, there's massive amount of people who do wonderful work in these areas as well. So that's where we should be turning as well to learn about this as well, which is also like moving on from the idea that we should romanticize certain kinds of knowledge systems, but actually offering them a platform of where they can become meaningfully remediated and based in certain kinds of perhaps certain rights discourse, but also perhaps different kinds of recognition of for instance, territorial rights and property rights, as we know is often the debate quite concretely as well. Who owns what?
Yeah, I think this it would be definitely helpful that, as you mentioned, that we can have like build a legal framework to discuss different kinds of rights and how they mediate and negotiate on this platform. And our talk has already go on for like 1.5 hours, and I think probably we shall move to the next part to screen your like very recent audiovisual essay, which is called Seed, Image, and Land. And we're gonna start the next part of our conversation on the operative images. And for us, like as human, like with our 2 feet on the ground, we understand this planet and the nature in many cases from the aerial images, from the remote sensing process, and in talking about nature, that we cannot avoid talking about that how we perceive and present nature. So thanks for your presentation and discussion on the media geology. And then could you share screen and we can start screening this video essay?
I'm not sure if it's gonna work if I'm screening. I mean, I can try, but I wonder if it's because my huh?
Yeah, I know. So actually there are 2 options that we can share screen and to play the video online, and we can also we see that you share the link, and we can also open the link to, and which way do you prefer?
If people are able to use the link, I think it's safer because of there's always some problems with streaming via these apps certain already online content. So I've got a feeling that technically it might not work. I'm not sure if this opens to everyone, but we can try. So I put in a link.
Yeah. Actually, we can open the link with VPN connection, and I guess most of the audience here got VPN.
Yeah, so do you want to watch it now, or should we leave it for later and talk about it now?
Probably you can talk about it if you are free to talk about that.
Yeah, because we can also, like, everybody can watch this on their own time. I'm hopefully soon as well. I encourage you to, if you can get it open, hopefully.
Yeah.
So
can I ask, like, if we can just screen like a part of that so people get a sense of like what this video is talking about? So maybe just 1 or 2 minutes, like you can select an important part. Yeah, and then we can go on to talk about it.
That's a good idea. It's like even a couple of minutes from the beginning. So do you think it would work from if you share screen where it's do you think it can work from your computer? What do you think?
Maybe Yushen or our assistants can do that. And does anyone want to share screen? Yushen or because I got
okay, I'll share screen and try to see if it works on my side.
Yeah.
Let's try that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is really poetic video essay, and we just watch it, and there are some clips including Tavwotsky's sacrifice, and also some clips from I guess from where like documentaries or something.
So I only played the first 3 and 47 seconds of the video. It seems that the sound cannot come out.
Yes, but at least we got a glimpse of it as well. And indeed, there's a whole great soundscape designed by Maria Andueza Olmedo. So anyone who's wanting, please do access and listen to it as well with headphones. It's much better as well that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can totally feel the perception from the audio-visual essays is not the designed for visuality, but also for the sound. So thank you so much. And I think you have much to say about operational image and this video, and that's welcome.
Yeah, I'll talk about this a bit. I'll do a sort of a short intro and just a brief one. So as mentioned, Geology of Media has been continued in different ways, and this is a project that is a collaborative project, and also in that sense, not just academic, but a collaboration with the artist Abelardo Gil Fournier. And it was commissioned by Photo Museum Winterthur as part of a cluster they were compiling called Strike Situations. And we proposed to do this particular audiovisual essay on the notion of seed bombing as a way of reforesting and replanting derelict areas, partly a speculative idea, partly small scale replanting and reseeding. So besides this concrete context of the images that we used and found footage, all of it, we wanted to use this opportunity to think of those questions that were perhaps relevant to geology of media as well. That what is the surface? Both surface of an image and a screen, and the surface of growth as it's defined in plant physiology and various other contexts of vegetal growth, leading into very recent developments like precision farming and data-intensive farming and other forms of transformation of rural surfaces. So towards the end of the essay, I pitched the term platform ruralism as an antidote or continuation of platform urbanism. But all of this relates to our theoretical work that is part of this project on operational images as well, that was mentioned. So operational images is a longer project, 5-year project that I'm leading as part of the university in Prague in Czech, and where it refers to a concept by filmmaker Harun Farocki, who talks, and through his video works as well in early 2000s especially, talked about operational images as those specialist images that do not merely represent anything for humans, but they function in an operation. So his examples were things like early machine vision system and robotic systems and automated reading systems, but also automated missile systems and navigation systems. And in this way, we were interested in this video, but also other work of trying to work with this notion of operation, like many other artists have done over the past years, like Hito Style, but also Trevor Paglen, where most of these other people have worked with questions of machine vision and artificial intelligence. But we wanted to also look at questions of plants and growth and agriculture. So redescribing also Earth surfaces as images that are operated upon. So the reforesting, for instance, is conceptualized as a greening, a literal visual photosynthetic idea, of course, as well, but looking at these legacies of light as they become conceptualized in sciences about photosynthesis, plants, but also biology and geology. and then trying to think of what is the legacy of light that is not just photographic in relation to human images, but the legacy of light as it relates to growth, again, photosynthesis, and multiple forms of manipulation of photosynthesis in contemporary practices as well, for instance, farming. So there's a lot there that you can see packed into it, besides it being about seed bombing. So it really is about those questions that are at the center of the contemporary Anthropocene discussions about vegetal growth, forms of technological invention into so-called natural processes, understanding questions of agriculture and food as part of things that we can talk about also in media studies and art. So there's a lot there that might be of interest to people, whether it's through this legacy of alternative images, specialist images, technical images, but also those things about, let's say, I'm using these terms a bit broadly, but landscape and territory as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. It totally makes sense. I'm very interested in your conception of platform ruralism, because it reminds me of platform capitalism that most European and also Chinese people would talk about. So it's like we focus on urban, and we focus on urban digitalization, but we seldom talk about ruralism and how countryside can be connected with digital objects and technologies. So maybe, probably, do you have any definition of platform ruralism?
Not as a high one, but I would say that exactly those terms that you mentioned, discourse about platform capitalism as a mode of capture and governance of data, and mode of governance about subjectivity, pertains to the idea of what platform ruralism might be about, as well as capture. Some might say extraction, but let's say capture, manipulation, governance of data about processes of growth, for instance, in agricultural terms. So the idea, and again, I'm sure there are, again, specialists who worked on this. I'm coming it from the point of my interest in media studies, and it's still under development. But there's a whole way in which a lot of experimentation with data governance and data systems and data intensive forms of manipulation. And I'm not using manipulation only negatively, of processes of growth, whether it's in farming, for instance. That's where there's a lot of experimentation is happening as well. So there's a broader discourse, of course, been going on in architecture as well about the meaning of countryside and such, and for longer time as well. So we need to look at this as part of that discussion about extended infrastructures of extended urbanism as well. So I would link it to those discussions for sure as well. But it's basically the definition would be then about techniques and technologies and frameworks of understanding processes of, for instance, plant growth as data, and integrating that data into different sorts of systems where it becomes sometimes capitalized and sometimes in other ways biased.
Right, I think someone interrupts, and maybe the host and then Susan can mute someone.
Yeah, there's somebody's
somebody like we have an audience that didn't mute themselves.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you so much. Anyway, because you mentioned, and I can feel that you have no certain idea about the definition, and I feel like is that a kind of neutral attitude towards platform ruralism? Because actually, when we want to overturn or want to find an alternative way of of using technology. We also review, we also represent and review those phenomena of top-down hierarchy and rigid system of operating images. So, but for at least you are doing some projects at terraforming, and you are also quite understanding the interdisciplinary projects. So I feel like that you probably hold a kind of neutral attitude towards that, which means you find that technology is not evil. You can let a technology adapt to the surrounding. Is it in that way to understand platform realism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good way of understanding, I would say, and it's a good attitude towards most technical and social systems as well. And it sort of relates to this term, recently deceased philosopher who mobilized it, Bernhard Stiegler, called, his understanding of pharmacon in this sense as well, which I'm sure is, used in multiple ways in philosophies of technology, creative ways as well, but the ways, relates to this as well, that we must refrain from simplistic ideas, at least, of that technology or something is just good or bad. It is always a much more complex bundle of impact and use and implications that is at stake, especially when we think of, for instance, technologies and design as unfolding over a time. So something that is good now will be bad. Yeah, something that is bad now will be, potentially seen in a very different way in 100 years. So there's a whole complex bundle of these ideas of beyond good and bad that is at stake here as well. And I think that one of our roles is to evaluate these in ways that is not a knee-jerk reaction, especially in terms of new technologies. And that's a key part of Strelka as well. And that doesn't mean that we are being apolitical, that we are not caring for things like social justice. I would say that it's a way of trying to understand of what are the implications of these things for particular forms of social justice. For instance, I don't think that there would be a lot of theorists who, for a good reason, say that technologies of abstraction are bad because they, alienate us from particular relation to this and that. But I think that there's much to be said about the necessity of abstractions at the backbone of understanding multiple scales, or, for instance, in context of climate science and such. So sometimes abstractions that are enabled by technologies are our best friend, because they help to understand these multiple scales of impact.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's like mediation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just have one curious question. So why you choose Prague as the city to execute this project?
It's a good city. Prague is because I was doing some things with the colleagues there. So it's at the Academy of Performing Arts, and especially in the school of FAMU, FAMU, which is renowned for it had a special place in cinema, and especially practical cinema education as well, and still is. And there was a wonderful opportunity with colleagues there, and we got funding for this project from the Czech Science Foundation. So we basically, it's also because of those reasons that we managed to get Czech funding, and it's placed in a department of photography. But of course, a lot of the things we do is much beyond traditional notions of photography or even artistic photography, but really at that interface of where does the legacy or the history of photography or even contemporary practice of photography transform into these other forms of imaging, both historical forms of imaging like photogrammetry, or specialist imaging like use of photograph in astronomy or other sciences, and then the relation to contemporary images where it's not photographic image anymore, but calculational image, procedural image, perhaps one could say, and measuring image. So a lot of things about machine vision, for instance, become relevant in this sense. So I think there's an interesting way of using the notion of operational image and the ways in which we're in Prague for this project to think of this transformation of the photographic image as well in relation to these specialist imaging practices, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And also I asked that because like Prague has a history like in experimental film, and in your audiovisual essay you have also bring out a question at how we form an image of wind, and you have shown some aerial photos of the forest and the wind and how the landscape is being changed and the atmosphere. And also like because like in our exhibits we have also mentioned this atmospheric wind that happened in the film, and Xuefei actually is from like a film theorist background, and she has more to say about it. And also like this atmospheric flow in some Chinese film making, especially in Hong Kong, is very related to the 文人电影. I don't know how to translate that, but those like a scholarly film that who really fantasize the nature landscape and the atmospheric flow. So it's a very interesting topic that if we can discuss, but like it's already like 11:30 here.
Yeah, it's getting late. People are gonna doze off in front of their computers, but it's true, and I'm glad you point out the legacy of experimental film in Prague, and then the ways in which it relates to contemporary practices. There's the poetic or metaphysical things that are really interesting in terms of how do we talk about atmospheric processes by way of often proxies of how to understand wind, but also then how it relates to modes of simulation of these processes that you were talking about. So Harun Farocki's own work was, for instance, interested in what is wind, for instance, in computer simulation. What does wind mean anymore? And then of course, there would be the sort of a like scientific modeling of complex turbulent phenomena, whether it's wind or hydraulic phenomena and other things as well. So there's super interesting things where the poetic and scientific entangle both in the legacy of experimental, but also our experimental things we do in your exhibition and in my work and many other people's work.
Yeah, and actually in our next talk next week, we're gonna connect with Janine Renderson. I don't know, like probably you guys also know each other, and she will be talking about like those atmosphere, the data flow, and probably we're gonna talk about Trevor Packlin. You have also mentioned his work, and he has mapped those computer recognized network on the cloud. To create like a comparison between the nature and how the facial recognition software to see us. And since it's already pretty late and we're gonna make a conclusion as to see if our audience have questions. Yeah. Xuefei, do you wanna conclude in Mandarin so it's more accessible to our audience?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, 所以就是也非常感谢大家今天就是一直坚持到这里。然后我们其中其实大家也可以看到我们两位策展人的不同方向。那么我在理论上可能会聊很多的哲学术语，然后呢，我也尽量就是在底下有去打下来。然后大家如果对，因为 Parikka 教授是一个很博学，同时也很有趣的人，所以你也可以看到他同时可以聊哲学术语，也可以聊非常设计或者是跟城市建筑有关的。然后所以感哲学的朋友也可以再去多了解了解。那么感兴趣于建筑和设计，包括如何去在政府与设计师之间协调的话，也可以多多关注我们的策展项目，包括项目里跟 Parikka 教授以及Terraforming 这个 Strelka Institute 有关的资料。然后非常感谢大家。对，然后一璇有什么比较想说的吗？
我主要想看看观众有没有想要去提问的，或者说 你们觉得有什么概念是今天听到，但可能不是了解的不是很多，想要去更多的去了解。然后，因为我们还会有一些 translation projects，going on later，然后也是想看大家有什么想要更多去了解的内容。
其实我对那个Geophysics very interesting that 就是那个概念感觉很有趣。然后一开始我们因为没有翻译嘛，那可能很多朋友也不了解。但其实即便有了这个翻译，我们也不能去了解，因为它这个词本身在英文里面也是一个构词，就是因为这个项目而新构的词。不知道有没有观众感兴趣的？Yeah, so we're just talking about that terminology is really interesting, and even without Chinese translation, we can also just go directly into the English version because this is a completely new terminology. Yeah, and thank you so much if you, and we are really looking forward to more translation from your work and more collaborations later.
Yes, I would be so happy as well, and I hope that there will be more future possibilities for indeed collaborations. Extremely rewarding for me as well to be in dialogue with you and all the projects you're doing. So it's been really impressive, and I want to also congratulate you for this work and the projects you put together and the whole curatorial stream of activity. So thank you for having me as part of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, actually I saw one more question from our chat box. Like there's one audience was asking about the neo-colonialism. I think you had that on PowerPoint, but we didn't really go into that topic because in the colonialism, like in our exhibit, in our past talk, we have talked about those industrial cities and those process of making things. But how about neo-colonialism in now times?
Yeah, it's broadly speaking, this is the very short answer, but I wanted to point out both in the book and in my interests, and also the work we do in terms of certain, both quite symbolic, but quite concretely material patterns of continuity from, let's say, classical colonial forms of expropriation and extraction industries, of how they're continuing still under certain nation state sovereignty and such, for instance, on the indigenous lands, whether it relates to mining on indigenous lands in Australia, or the various years of important struggles against pipeline projects, fossil fuel and gas pipe projects in North Americas, or then in my home country in Finland as well, where there's a traditional Sami people's reindeer herding lands. There's project plans that might be endangering them, infrastructural plans and such. So there's a lot to be said about that by obviously continued importance and intensive militarized geopolitics around the extraction industries in new territories, and what it does in relation to nation states and various indigenous peoples' lands as well, which are the vulnerable sites still in ways that unfortunately reproduces a lot of the violence that was already part of, again, quote unquote, classical colonialism as well. So there's a clear reason why a lot of the work by contemporary philosophers of geology and Anthropocene are especially focusing on articulating the notion of geological periodization from the point of view of violence and extraction and territorial sovereignty, or the lack of sovereignty on territorial deposits.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thanks for explaining all those terminologies and contribute so much to this talk. And thanks for our audience. We still have like 75 people stayed in this chat room, and which is amazing that you guys stay up to so late in Beijing to listen to us like talking for like 2 hours. And I think there's also like many audience on our live stream platform, on the other platform. So thank you so much like to the Professor Parikka and to OCAT Institute and our audience still remained in the 腾讯会议 chat room. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. There would have been a session about scale as well, but I don't know if we have time to engage with the multiscalar worlds, which is part of the Strelka thing of multiscalarity, but also a key point for me. And I just want to say briefly about scale. Just the last thing is that to me, the question of scale is interesting in terms of how it can be articulated through practices in relation to design in the broadest sense, but how it's become incorporated also in feminist literature. So Joanna Zielinska's work on Anthropocene deals with scale. And interestingly, people like Rosi Braidotti have been thinking about what is the notion of the subject that is multiscalar in relation to non-anthropocentric subject, but multiscalar that doesn't ignore either those questions of social justice as well. So there's a wonderful interview on this notion of scale and anthropomorphism, a short one, with Rosi Braidotti in the art magazine Freeze from some years back. So I think one can find that as a way of entering into the sort of a new materialism of scale through that question as well. And we could continue forever, and I know that it's late, so we need to stop now.
Yeah. Because like as you mentioned, can I just say one more thing? Like because you mentioned the problem of scale, and it's really important in the design world. And one thing that I want to point out is that we have like incorporated some design projects, and we're also looking at some other projects that's dealing with air control and interior climate control, because air that goes through our body goes through the interior climate and goes through the entire city, this region, and become part of the atmosphere. Like it really goes through many different scales. And in the age of climate change, and in the age of like this COVID-19, the sprout in this entire world, how the sanitization and the interior climate control and the protection of just even oneself is a really important issue, and how to create a like intermediate surface between the body and the outside climate, and between the interior and the exterior, and even just like between like a climate within the island and the climate outside the island. So like what damn, I can't think of his name. Like this geodesic dome that happened in Manhattan. Like that's like a big issue.
Buckminster Fuller.
Buckminster Fuller. Yeah, Buckminster Fuller's sphere. Like those are important issues that we're discussing nowadays. And actually, if we can stay for a little bit longer, and actually, there's another question on the intensity of sensing. When you mentioned that in the operative image, because many of them, there are error image that's from remote control, and not as how we imagine that the Earth is evenly graded and is evenly sensed by the satellites. Actually, there's like intensity of sensing at a certain region, and there's a low intensity of sensing probably at the ocean, as related to the concept of rural. Because like if we think of like rural as like all the region that besides the city, and like all those rural places, so they are at a low intensity of grading and sensing, and how this satellites and the remote sensing technology affect how we understand our city, and how we understand the allocation of this natural resource, and how we manipulate them are related to this like grading system.
Yeah, I barely can comment. I think that the point is excellent. And it relates to, I think you put it really well already. And it relates thus to the question that, again, our colleagues in architecture and geography have been talking about, the ways in which the territorial needs to be expanded outside the sort of a soil territories to encompass of what are the modes of indexing and qualifying such territories like oceans or ocean floors and other things as well. So it's an integration of these, particular territories as well, that is at stake in a lot of the geopolitics of the questions as well. So and that's where the intensity comes in as well, I think. And there would be probably much more interesting things to be said about as well, to continue that, what you already posed. It's a excellent point.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the conversation. We just go on for another 50 minutes.
We could easily, and we could talk so much about scale, but I'll really going to shut up, because otherwise we'll continue way too long.
Yeah, we'll have like future, because like Ed and Xuefei, we're gonna look at the geodesign and the air, territory and the land in our future curatorial practice. And so I think definitely there's opportunity for us to collaborate and work in the future, and we can discuss like forever on the scale, word sensing, whatever.
Excellent.
Yeah, I really appreciate all your academic ability and also a good sense of technology and architecture. For me, I just understand through a academic way, and Yishen can manage the whole organization and architectural design. So maybe it's a good way to talk later, and we can both share our point of view. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. This has been really, really, really rewarding. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.